lesson, we learned about Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was from the state of Virginia, a Confederate state. Despite this, he was asked by President Lincoln to lead the Union Army. He refused. Robert E. Lee was also asked by Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, to lead the Confederate Army. He refused at first, but eventually agreed to take command. Robert E. Lee was affectionately called the Old Man by his troops. He was the commander of the losing side in the Battle of Gettysburg. Today, we are going to learn about a woman named Clara Barton. Clara Barton earned a different nickname during the Civil War. As we read today, pay attention to what that nickname is and how she earned it. But first, we're going to go over some new vocabulary words. Wounded. Wounded means to be injured or hurt. So instead of saying that many soldiers were injured during the US Civil War, we could say that many soldiers were wounded during the war. If Mrs. Warren tripped but did not get hurt, then Mrs. Warren was not wounded. In our society, we have a lot of important people that help when people get wounded, like doctors or nurses. Compassionate. Compassionate means caring, or having or showing sympathy or pity. For example, Carly should be a veterinarian because she is so compassionate towards animals. Countless. Countless means that there are too many to count. For example, the stars in the sky are countless. Disasters. Disasters are events that cause a lot of destruction and pain. Anytime there is a natural disaster, such as a tornado or an earthquake, many good people and organizations rush to help those in need. This is a photo of Arlington Cemetery in Virginia, near Washington, D.C. Arlington Cemetery holds the graves of hundreds of thousands of U.S. veterans who fought in various U.S. wars. The Arlington Cemetery was founded or started just after the Civil War. By some measures, more American soldiers died during the Civil War than in all other American wars combined. At the end of the Civil War, over 600,000 Union and Confederate soldiers were dead. Compare that to 25,000 killed in the Revolutionary War, fought from 1775 to 1783, in which George Washington and his army won America's independence. 25,000 dead is no small number, but it is very small compared to 600,000. In addition to those killed, well over 1 million men were wounded or injured in the Civil War. More soldiers were killed and wounded in the Civil War compared to the Revolutionary War because the weapons were more advanced and care for the injured soldiers was so poor. Listen carefully to hear who will help improve care given to those wounded soldiers. Americans were no strangers to the horrors and death brought on by war, but the Civil War proved to be far bloodier than any war before it. The Battle of Antietam, fought in Maryland, proves a strong example of how the Civil War was a war like no other. On September 17, 1862, there were more than 21,000 casualties in a single day, including nearly 4,000 killed on both sides. That means that about 1 of every 6 soldiers who took the field that day at Antietam was either killed or wounded within a few hours. Despite all its horrors, war can sometimes bring out the best in people, for there are those who fight to save lives as well. Clara Barton was one such person who wished only to lessen the suffering and pain. She was a school teacher from Massachusetts and had always been known as a loving, compassionate person, meaning that she cared for other people and wanted to make their lives better. Clara Barton had no formal schooling as a medical nurse, yet by the war's end, she would become one of the most famous nurses in history. Clara Barton was in Washington, D.C. after the First Battle of Manassas, where hundreds of wounded Union soldiers returned after losing a battle that everyone thought they would win easily. The hospitals in the city were quickly overcrowded. There were not enough beds or medical supplies to take care of all of the wounded. Clara Barton immediately went around the city knocking on doors and collecting bandages and medicine from people's homes. Clara Barton helped to care for and save hundreds of wounded soldiers after the First Battle of Manassas. During this time, she recognized the bigger problem. While all of the generals and politicians were busy figuring out how to build their armies and win battles, nobody had given serious thought to taking care of the thousands of men who would undoubtedly be wounded. This was not fair to the soldiers, so Clara Barton decided that she would do something about it herself. She began by writing letters and visiting doctors, politicians, and other leaders, encouraging them to invest more money in medical supplies for the soldiers. She visited women's groups, churches, and hospitals. She called on wealthy individuals to donate or give medical supplies and money to help the wounded. Soon, Clara Barton had collected a large assortment of supplies, but she did not stop there because the supplies would not do anyone any good unless they were delivered to the battlefield. Take a minute to make a prediction. What do you think Clara Barton is going to do? Those who were wounded in battle experienced terrible suffering. If you look at this picture, you can see lots of wounded soldiers lying on the ground. They were often left lying on the field for an entire day or even longer because everyone was too busy fighting to come and carry them away. Field hospitals, where the wounded were taken during and after battles, were sometimes set up in nearby barns or houses, or simply in a group of tattered tents. Soldiers in overcrowded field hospitals often found themselves left alone, bleeding, lying on the ground, with nobody to bring them food or water or to comfort them and ease their pain. The doctors were simply too busy and too tired to help everyone. Thousands of men died who could have lived if only the hospitals had all of the supplies they needed. Knowing this, towards the end of 1861, Clara Barton started following the main Union Army wherever it went. This army was in charge of protecting Washington, D.C., although its ultimate goal was to attack Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, and win the war. Wherever the Union Army fought, Clara Barton followed with her wagon loads of bandages and other supplies, making sure the doctors had what they needed. Whenever possible, she made food for the sick and the wounded, brought them water, comforted them, made sure they had blankets, wiped sweat from their foreheads, fixed their bandages, and simply talked to them. Still, Clara Barton was determined to do more. So many wounded soldiers lay suffering on the battlefield for hours, sometimes even days, waiting for someone to come and help. Clara Barton wanted to be able to go to those soldiers on the battlefield when they needed her help the most. Unfortunately, women were not allowed on the battlefields. At least, that is what the generals told her whenever she asked permission to come help during the battles. But Clara Barton kept asking and insisting that she would be able to save lives. Finally, in 1862, she received permission to go to the heart of the battles themselves. Clara Barton became known as the Angel of the Battlefield to soldiers and doctors who were always glad to see her calm face amid the horrors of war. She was there at Antietam, where more than 12,000 Union soldiers were wounded, far more than she and all the other nurses and doctors could care for, but they did their best. Once the battle was over, she would hurry back to Washington, D.C. to collect more supplies and then catch up with the army again. By the middle of 1863, the Union Army figured out how to make sure the field hospitals had enough supplies. This was partly thanks to the fact that Clara Barton kept pressure on the War Department and other officials in Washington, D.C. to make real changes. She no longer had to collect supplies, but she continued to follow the army for the remainder of the war, acting as the angel of the battlefield to countless wounded soldiers. Remember, countless means that there were too many to be counted. Clara Barton saw more bloodshed and fighting than most soldiers during the war. She was there at some of the worst battles. She worked as bullets and cannonballs whistled overhead and crashed all around. Once, a bullet tore right through her shirt sleeve, but she was very brave and did not let fear stop her from doing what she needed to do. When the war ended, Clara Barton continued to find ways to help others. In fact, she was only just beginning. She went to Europe and worked as a nurse in wars over there. During the course of her life, she went to work in Turkey, China, Cuba, and other places. She returned to America and in 1881 founded or started the American Red Cross to provide medical supplies, food, and other aid during natural disasters, such as floods and earthquakes. Today, the American Red Cross is still run by volunteers, people who donate their time for free in order to help other people in need. Clara Barton helped countless people during her lifetime. And although there are still wars and other disasters in this world, Clara Barton would be glad to know that the American Red Cross continues to save lives and give comfort to people in need to this very day.